So you want to get into fantasy, but you don't really know where to start. I've got you. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Sydney, and today we're going to be chatting all about the fantasy genre, giving you a bunch of recommendations from light to epic high fantasy and everywhere in between. First and foremost, I want to say that this definitely isn't a comprehensive list. I do not think that this group of books is the end-all be-all, like only options for where you should start with fantasy, but fantasy is my favorite genre, and I do think that I've read quite a few and have accumulated a good chunk of books that I think could get you into fantasy depending on your level and where you want to be. Before we get into the actual book recommendations, I want to talk about what the difference between light or normal fantasy is compared to epic or high fantasy. And it all boils down to really the setting of the story. If the setting is in a place that is familiar to you or could be on our planet Earth, chances are it is a normal or light fantasy. A good recommendation of that is Lore by Alexandra Bracken. This book takes place in New York City, where a bunch of Greek gods will come down every 7 years. They walk the streets as mortals, giving their descendants the chance to kill them and claim their immortal power. So obviously there are fantasy elements here, but it takes place in New York City, which is a familiar place. Whether you've been there or not, it is on Earth. Or there is Spells for Forgetting by Adrienne Young, which takes place on a magical island that very much could be set somewhere on this planet. So even though the story takes place in a real world location, it subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, weaves in fantasy elements such as witchcraft, ancestral magic, deep-rooted island folklore. And since the magic is sometimes a little bit subtle, the way that it's talked about within the story can be subcategorized as magical realism, which is another one of my favorite little subgenres. Magical realism is sort of like finding small magics in everyday life. And this is a book that definitely has that. And it also has this sort of mystery thriller aspect to it as well. I think that this is a great recommendation if you're trying to get into just having magic around in a story. Then of course there is historical fantasy. And the recommendation I want to talk about is Babel by R.F. Kuang. Now I'm not really a historical fiction girl, but I will be the first one to tell you that this was my top book of 2022 when it came out. Number one, my favorite book that year. The writing and the story is just so beautiful. The fantasy elements are very light. The magic system isn't very prominent, though it is really interesting. The magic system involves language and translation, while the overarching plot talks about colonialism, race, wealth, class, identity, belonging, rebellion, and I clearly loved it a lot. Babel has an academic setting, but there is also another subgenre of fantasy called dark academia, which more often than not has fantasy elements. Just like this one, it is Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This one is considered light fantasy, but dark academia because it takes place at Yale, which is a real place, which is a college, so it is academic, but it's dark academia because the magic and things that are going on is a little bit more grim and dark. The fantasy elements in this stories are, but not limited to, secret societies, magic, rituals, ghosts, protection spells, necromancy, blood magic, and sacrifice. And before you get started on this one, know that it is the first book in a series. The last book, which I think is a good bridge book between light fantasy and high fantasy, is Immortal Longings by Chloe Gong. This book is still, I think, considered normal fantasy because it does take place in a city, which would be considered urban fantasy, but the city is a little bit more dystopian and not so much like something that we already have in this world. So that's why I think that it's a good bridge book, because it's familiar, but it still has some unfamiliar things. In this dystopian story, there's a city called Sanair, and every single year there is this sort of Hunger Games-esque situation where people join this competition and they fight to the death in hopes of being the victor and getting a bunch of riches, basically. And within the fantasy elements, these characters are able to body swap, which makes for a very interesting plotline. Okay, so all of those books are considered light to normal fantasy. But now we're gonna move into more high fantasy and epic fantasy. All of these stories have settings that are unfamiliar to us. They all have their own world building, their own magic systems and politics. I want to start with some YA fantasy because I do think that these ones that I'm going to start with are a little bit more accessible in terms of writing and how you will take in the information. And where I want to start is where I started. When I first found BookTube and I wanted to get back into reading, get back into fantasy, I started with the Shadow and Bone trilogy by Leigh Bardugo. Now hold on. I know that this series does catch some slack here on BookTube and the internet in general, but I will forever stand by this series being a phenomenal starting place getting into a higher fantasy setting. I think that this fantasy world is a great one to start with if you're looking to exercise the muscle of your brain that is wanting to explore worlds that are unfamiliar to you. The magic system in this story story I think is very complex, but the writing is very accessible. I don't mean this in a degrading way, but I think that the writing is nothing special. I think that it's just an easy series to read. That way you're able to focus on the world and the politics and the magic systems and sort of start to understand how fantasy will work in your own brain. This trilogy is right before the next duology that I want to recommend to you. You don't have to read the Grisha trilogy first, but I did, and I'm glad that I did, because these worlds are interconnected, and the duology that everyone here on BookTube will recommend to you, most everyone I will say, is Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom by the same author, Leigh Bardugo. Leigh obviously has had a fundamental part of my reading experience up until now, but Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom is a phenomenal duology. It's a magical heist. It is found family. These characters are pretty much staples here on BookTube. You will fall in love with them and you will root for them from the very beginning to the very end. The next duology I want to recommend is one that I think is a great progression from that series. The first book is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor, and the second one being Muse of Nightmares. I think that this duology is a good progression because it still does have some intricate world building and magic system, but the writing is a little bit more flowery, a little bit more poetic, but not overly so. It's a fun little YA duology. There are some characters that are a little bit more otherworldly, so not just humans within this story. I bet you can start to see how we're progressing here, yeah? Because next I want to recommend to you a couple of cozy fantasies. You've probably seen these around, but I think that these books are good starters for having different types of creatures be commonplace within a fantasy story. These are described as low stakes but high fantasy, and they are Legends and Lattes and Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldree. These have a main character that is an orc. Her name is Viv and she is a mercenary. In Legends and Lattes, she's wanting to open up a coffee shop and sell pastries. And in Bookshops and Bone Dust is actually a prequel to Legends and Lattes. This is when she gets hurt while being a mercenary and she has to rest in this sort of like sleepy beach town, and she discovers her love for reading. These are super fun. I love them so much. They're sort of comfort reads. A couple more YA fantasies that I definitely think deserve some hype. Crown of Feathers by Nikki Palprato is a completed trilogy that involves two sisters battling for the title of queen, and there are phoenix riders involved in this story. This fantasy world is very rich and very well explained. But another good fantasy series that I think you could start with is The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon, because this one still does have some real world feeling places like a city, but the main characters all have like magical abilities. So our main character is Paige and she's a clairvoyant in a world where being a clairvoyant is a crime. And in this world, there's an underground that has formed where these people are going to combat persecution and evade capture. There are certain elements within the story that also made me think of A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, and I haven't seen anyone else say anything wild like that, so maybe take that with a grain of salt, but the vibes are sort of there, which I will say A Court of Thorns and Roses is another series that have gotten a lot of people into reading recently, which is super exciting. If you are a romance girly and you want to get into fantasy, you should definitely look into romantasy or a romantic fantasy. There might be a video on that in the future. But furthering this one, in fantasy there is a classic trope of enemies to lovers. One of my favorite series that is now completed is Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, set in a magical land where our main character Zele is going on this journey to try to bring magic back. With the help of a rogue princess, they are both trying to outrun the prince who is hell-bent on eradicating magic for good. And things go from there. It's really well done. And Tomi Adeyemi is phenomenal. Now, listen, another series that I read in the very, very beginning of getting back into reading, getting back into fantasy, is A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. This is another completed trilogy with a world and magic system that is very special. In this world, there are 4 different Londons: red, black, gray, and white. All of them are basically the same London, but very different climates and magic systems in and of themselves. And there is a type of person called a traveler who can travel in between the Londons. And our main character, Kell, is the traveler, and he's having to deal with a whole slew of things, including our other main character, Delilah Bard, who is a cunning thief. But perilous magic is afoot and treachery lurks at every turn. To save all of the worlds, all 4 Londons, they'll first need to stay alive. This is a great trilogy. I think it's a great one to think abstractly about how a normal world like a London can be still very magical and also very otherworldly. Another staple urban fantasy series that I have read and loved is the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee. The metric system in this world is basically revolving around jade. Certain people are able to wield it and obtain increased like physical abilities. But other than that, it is a very character-driven plot in this like sort of like crime mob family. And it is so much fun. It's actually really devastating by the end. Like I ugly cried during Jade Legacy. but so worth it. Okay, next I want to do some standalones. One of my favorites ever is a Brandon Sanderson book called Trust of the Emerald Sea. This is, he says, sort of like his take on The Princess Bride, and it's one of those books that I think about and I look at and it just makes me happy because the fantasy world is so whimsical but also dangerous. The stakes are high, but it does have like a love story wrapped up in it. I think the magic system is so unique, and I do say that this is a great place to start with Brandon Sanderson, but more on him later because there are multiple places that you could start with his books. In this book, his writing is a little bit more whimsical and lighthearted than it is in other books, so I would say don't think that all of his writing will be like this, but I do think that this is a great book to start for the fantasy genre in general. Another standalone is The Sword of Kaigan by M.L. Wong. I personally love like a high fantasy war battle story, and this is a great one to start with to see if you might like that corner of high fantasy. This is a very character-driven book that gets pretty emotional at some times. This book explores a lot of different topics, some of which are like gender roles and very strict and rigid societal structures, and in turn sort of dismantling them. I still think about these characters, and I read this years ago. In very similar fashion, another really phenomenal trilogy where our main character is literally trained to become a weapon is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This fantasy definitely does touch on some darker topics. It is a little bit graphic at times, but this is one that I would reread. It's a really, really strong series. And again, if you think that you might like a high fantasy magic charged battle, this is sort of like a staple series. These two books I want to recommend because there's another little subgenre of fantasy that it's just sort of weird. Just like weird, sort of like puzzly fantasy, okay? So we have two that are very similar in my mind. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, and this would not be a Sid video if I didn't recommend The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. These are a little bit different in that The Starless Sea does have some real world settings, but you go in multiple different places that are very otherworldly. Now, Piranesi, you are pretty much exclusively in a world that is fantastical in its exploration. In The Starless Sea, every single thing that you read is a puzzle piece in this grand scheme of the plot, and it gets a little weird, it gets a little fever dreamy. This book, if you are interested in like poetic or lyrical or very beautiful writing, this is the one that you should try because I think that this is the bar for me. Like when I think about that type of writing, this is the first book that I will think of. It is a beautiful fantasy book. And Piranesi is very similar. The writing is stunning, but it is a lot shorter. So take that for what you will. It's a very atmospheric read. And in that sense, they're both a little bit more abstract in the magic and world building because some of it you just kind of have to vibe with and trust the process. Whereas a lot of other fantasy books, you do sort of get very set rules in the magic and world and systems. And these are not like that. So if you like weird or abstract, there are fantasy books for you as well. Really quick, we're going to circle back to Brandon Sanderson. He definitely could have his own video in its entirety, going through all of his books and where you should start. Other than Trust of the Emerald Sea, there are three places that are great starting points for his books, and those are Elantris and Warbreaker, which are both standalones, or you can read one of his first trilogies, which is the Mistborn trilogy, and the first one is The Final Empire. Out of all of these, Elantris is actually my favorite, and then the Mistborn series, and then, of course, The Way of Kings, which is book one in the Stormlight Archive. This is a very chunky book, a very chunky series, but it is as good as everyone says it is. If you are looking for a challenge in a sense of being with characters and a world for a significant amount of time, definitely pick up the Stormlight Archive, but because of its length, I do consider it a little bit more of an advanced fantasy reader choice just because of how long everything is. It takes a lot of time and commitment. I think similarly to The World of the Way of Kings is one of my favorite series, if not my favorite series, The Faithful and the Fallen. First one is Malice by John Gwynne. A lot of epic or high fantasy stories will kind of touch on the concept of good versus evil, and this is no different. It has a classic like fallen angel versus like demon sort of style story, and each side has a champion that they are basically pitted against each other. And this is a thick 4-book fantasy series that even before the first book is over, you care so much for the characters. I don't know how John Gwynne does it, but this series is my Roman Empire. This book has a lot of like magical creatures. It has war, politics, battle, an animal companion, or many animal companions. And it is just so good. If you're wanting a fantasy that sort of feels a little bit more like classic fantasy, definitely try out Robin Hobb. She has so many books, and the first series that is widely recommended to start with is the Farseer trilogy. The first one is Assassin's Apprentice. This one is our main character Fitz is the bastard son of a noble prince prince, and he ends up getting picked up by the nobility, and they try to train him in the magic of the skill, mostly so that he can't get kidnapped by their enemies and used against them. So it's not really like for good reasons, it's mostly because they're selfish. But he is soon getting thrust into his first mission, and I would say that this book is definitely more like character versus plot. You really get to know Fitz and all the characters involved. And I see this series and Robin Hobb as a writer as sort of like cozy, but also I know that she holds no punches. People who read her books are continuously talking about how devastated they are by the end of them. Another book that sort of feels a little bit more classic is Age of Myth by Michael J. Sullivan. Of course, this is another first book in a series. It is completed, just like Robin Hobb's books. And this one, there are two different races of beings. One of them is the Frey, who are seemingly immortal, but one of them falls to our main character's blade, and he is now deemed the god killer. Another main character is a seer who prophesizes that basically everyone is going to die. The tagline is "The Age of Myth is over, time of rebellion has begun." This series has another great cast of characters, phenomenal plot line, with a little bit of like humor within the writing. Very well placed, at times is cozy, but is also very high stakes and action packed. I think that fantasy is such a phenomenal genre because even though mentally you might be traveling to faraway, distant lands, so many things within the plot and dialogue and storytelling can still be related to everyday life. I really do hope you found this video a little bit helpful and walked away with at least one book recommendation. If that is the case, let me know down below what book or what series you're most excited to look into. But if you don't know what else to say, then leave me the crossed swords emoji down below in the comments. And while you're down there, please do subscribe and like the video. I always appreciate your support. And of course, be kind to one another and happy reading. I'll see you soon. Bye.